Hey everyone, Nathan here, president of Saybrook University. Welcome to another episode of Saybrook Insights. I've been thinking a great deal lately about how I interact with those whom I differ. It's tough. I mean, who doesn't like to think their position is ironclad, is right as rain, is spot on? Over the last couple of years, that has only increased, I think, not just with me, but across the country as social, cultural, political issues have been and have become increasingly charged, polarizing as a case really. Now, some people suggest this whole phenomenon of polarization is overblown. There is that subset of folks out there. Yet, I don't know about you, but I think we're seeing increasing incivility, violence, and discussions that are pitched, to say the least, at least here in the United States. And here in this country, we're also hearing murmurs about dissolution, separation, divorce. Admittedly, this isn't a common sentiment, but it's more pitched now than ever before. My own journey in trying to be part of the solution is in large part recognizing three things. One, I don't have the answers nor a monopoly on the truth. Two, there's often a lot more context to the polarization we're seeing across our country and even around the globe. And by that, I'm talking not just sociological, I'm talking psychological and at the individual as well as the group level. And three, listening more to those registering their discontents. And when I say listen, I'm talking really trying to hear. I go back to where I grew up and the very traditional ways of many in the communities we lived in. Definitely, there was and remains a sense that these places are what embody America. When I got married and we settled in larger cities in the state of Ohio, my own mind was open exponentially to different politics, things to do, and just ways of being in general. And what I noticed is like two ships passing in the night, our larger communities and smaller towns and hamlets were passing each other with the gap between them becoming too great in some instances for a life raft to make a difference for anyone from either of these locations. And found myself, I think, lot like others over the years, closing off, forgetting the context, and maybe listening less, a lot less. Indeed, there's a lot of pain and torment in our country right now. What has started to surface for me, at least, is coming to the whole conversation with a lot more humility, seeking a lot more context, and doing a great deal more listening is going to do a heck of a lot more good than what's happening now. That's my small part. And I think that's one big component of the humanistic piece, really, recognizing the whole system, not just the parts, recognizing that there's more to this lived experience, acknowledging that to achieve our greatest potential as individuals and as a society, we must be in journey together, especially if we're to address this polarization, the mental health challenges facing our country at the moment and our globe. And along with all of this, psychology, along with counseling and social work and other helping professions, offer us hope. Enter Dr. Kirk Schneider, one of the nation's eminent humanistic psychologists. He's written extensively in this area of psychology around polarization and as well as around rediscovering awe, along with a host of other topics, including, as I mentioned, the polarized mind. His pioneering work and passion for psychology resulted in his seeking the presidency of the American Psychological Association, which we'll hear about in this episode. Kirk brings an important perspective, offering a fresh lens in how we live, how we learn, and work together. And he also drives home the importance of mental health as a vital centerpiece for our nation's long term well being. I could not agree more. We're going to try and pack in a lot in this episode, and I suspect Dr. Schneider will be back for a great deal more. All right, let's get going with Dr. Kirk Schneider. Dr. Kirk Schneider, what a joy to have you on Saybrook Insights. You're one of the leading voices of our country in existential and humanistic psychology. It is just an honor and a privilege to have you here today. Before we get started, would love for you to tell the audience about yourself, your personal history as it relates to psychology, and your journey to Saybrook.
Well, thanks so much, Nathan. It's been a long road. If I really went in depth in terms of what led me to then the Humanistic Psychology Institute, we'd be here all night. But basically, it began with having very psychologically oriented parents. My father was a humanistic educator, he was a school teacher, but eventually he became a professor of education. And his specialty was creativity in kids. So he really fostered that with me. We did a lot of audio recordings of plays and skits that we made up and so on. So that was kind of the beginning of being immersed in, thinking about human behavior and experience. And my mother was actually a radio and television spokesperson, but very interested in psychology, especially psychoanalysis. And she was actually in psychoanalysis herself. And when I was about two and a half, my 7-year-old brother died of a barrage of diseases, especially pneumonia. I just couldn't deal with that back in the late 50s. So that was my very brute introduction to psychology, really, to existential psychology, because it really just turned my world upside down, my parents' world upside down for a good period of time. It was like a rip in the fabric of the routine and familiar. And suddenly, nothing was routine and familiar after he passed away at 7. And, they weren't the same parents, really, in a way, understandably. So I had a lot of fears, a lot of anxieties around that time, and it became pretty rough. My father, especially, was concerned that I might be losing it because I was so overwhelmed with fears of death, of illness. I felt like monsters were gathering around my window at night, so all kinds of night terrors. Anyway, it was actually my mother who referred me through her analyst to a child analyst. So at about 4 or 5 years old, I saw a child analyst for a sustained period of time. And I have to think that he helped turn my life around, along with my parents' own recovery in their own right. I just have to say that I feel like I was very blessed to have psychologically minded parents, to have this psychoanalysis at a very young age, where the main thing I remember was his presence to me. And I felt met and I felt held. And I think those were probably the most important qualities in helping me eventually come to terms with, to a degree, come to terms with the shattering of that loss.
That's right. Before you continue, this is first of all, I want to thank you for sharing such a very deep moment in your life. I'm positive I've never heard this piece of your biography, and it's powerful in its own right in terms of your own psychological journey. What is if we could just spend a moment on what recovery looked like for your parents and for you. You've alluded to that already a bit. I can only imagine with the loss of a child what that would look like and the journey that would take.
I think it's almost unimaginable.
Yeah.
Well, for my mother, I believe she had to go away for a period of time. I don't think it was that long. And I think my grandmother took over while my dad was at work. And my dad was a pretty steady kind of guy. He managed to hang in there, was very loving with me, and she certainly attempted to be, as loving and caring as she could be. But I think she just needed some time to get herself together
For sure.
to continue parenting. In any case, that was probably a period of several weeks, and they found their footing again. As I say, my mother went on into her career. I mean, she was an amazing woman, amazing person for that era, to be a leading spokesperson for the major illuminating company in Cleveland.
Oh my.
So she was also on radio. She eventually had her own radio program on one of the leading local networks, and just extremely bright person. So they always encouraged inquiry and discussion. That was a really important part of my relationship with them. And of course, there were very sad and difficult times as well. But overall, I just feel the world for them and their ability to support me.
And it sounds like their own orientation to being able to engage in that discussion, to open up to that discussion with you. I don't know too many parents that would be, I guess, that open minded to. Well, maybe I'm projecting here, but it seems like that would have led to some element of their recovery process, especially after losing your brother.
I think so. And my father was deeply influenced by people like Eric Fromm and Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers, especially, and Rollo May to some degree. I mean, I was brought up immersed in those works by those people. So I almost feel like I was kind of born for this field. I was introduced to these humanistic thinkers in a childlike way through my dad to a great extent, and my mother had an attunement to them as well. So I think that was very critical in their own recovery too, because, clearly all of those writers had very important things to say about cultivating, a meaningful and loving life. That was conveyed to me through osmosis to some extent, and also through direct, especially with my father, conversations about difficult themes, like movies we'd see or books we'd read. It was very encouraging discussing them.
It's interesting you raised that as a child that you were exposed to these complex thoughts from Maslow and May and Rogers. I was just having a conversation with Drake Spaeth about this very thing, that he's actually an advocate for teaching children about existential psychology, because there's at no point in anyone's life, or at any point in anyone's life, you can have, and you do have, see existential crises and emergences that come about at any age. And what a gift to you that had to have been, to have your family in that space.
It really was. I don't want to downplay the edginess that that was involved.
I'm sure there was. Yeah, yeah. So with this lineage around humanistic psychology that you were exposed to, clearly that seems to have marked a path for you going into your academic life. So maybe speak just for a moment about how you found your way into that space and then into Saybrook.
Well, yes, I had some trouble in school, I think partly because of emotional issues. I mean, I did okay, but I really blossomed when it came to subjects like the arts and humanities, sociology in high school, and psychology, especially when I got to college at Ohio State. And then graduate school is when I really got turned on. It was like a wonderland for me of philosophical and psychological thinking. But at the same time, my dad was meeting colleagues at conferences like the Humanistic Education Conference, who told him about this very extraordinary humanistic psychology graduate school, actually on the East Coast, which was West Georgia College at the time. And my dad highly recommended that I consider it. He knew something about Mike Ahrens, who was the president there, who was a protege of Maslow from the Brandeis department. So it's a fairly new school. It was around for about 10 years at that time. And I had a fascinating experience at West Georgia for my master's. And I met a wonderful teacher who I taught for, Don Rice. He had just gotten back from working with R.D. Laing at his clinic in London. He was full of fascinating stories. And then I found out that he was a graduate of then the Humanistic Psychology Institute. And Don highly recommended that I contact the school. I had some other options which either didn't work out because my own thinking about that direction, or the school, was not very accepting of my humanistic orientation. But in any case, that's pretty much how I made the connection with then the Humanistic Psychology Institute. Also, Stanley Krippner had given some talks at West Georgia, and Don was a student of his as well at the Maimonides Dream Laboratory. So I had some beginning connection with Stanley, and when I got accepted to Saybrook, I became Stanley's work study assistant for a couple of years. So he really introduced me to a lot of colleagues as well. And then also almost from the beginning at the Humanistic Psychology Institute, Linda Conti, who was the PR marketing person for the school, wonderful person, knew that I loved Rollo May's work. And she invited me to meet with him and to write an article about Rollo. So that was probably my first article. It was in the Humanistic Psychology Institute Perspectives, the magazine. And I had an amazing chance to meet Rollo in his Tiburon home, overlooking the whole Bay Area. But it was a wonderful connection with Rollo. And I think we actually felt a native connection in large part because I was also very interested in the paradoxes of life. And I feel like I had experienced those from a very early age. You know, that in a sense we're food for worms at one level, but also soaring angels.
That's right.
And that was very much Rollo's perspective, that kind of mixed view of the human condition, which is also a very vital and energizing view, because it's brings out the poignancy, the depth, the fullness of living, being in touch with your vulnerability as well as your great capacity to create and transcend.
Indeed. Indeed.
That was the beginning. And then I had an amazing opportunity to work with Jim Bugental, who I met at my first national conference
Fabulous.
in January 1980 at HQ. He offered a 9-month long mentorship that was both didactic and experiential, partly at Westerbeck Ranch. And it was only like 10 students. So I was with him for 9 months, and he introduced us to Irv Yalom, to Maurice Friedman, and to other luminaries in the existential psychology field. And then I had the opportunity to intern for him as his supervisee and his wife, his beautiful, and wonderful wife, Elizabeth, at their low cost counseling center called Interlock. And I spent almost 3 years in that clinical training.
My mind is already blown. Just, I mean, in that short period of time, you intersected with some of the luminaries in humanistic psychology and found your way working with them for extended periods of time in very deep, authentic ways. It sounds like that's pretty incredible.
It's incredible. And then Jim introduced me to Rollo also because he took our group to Rollo's home, and that began a deeper relationship with Rollo and eventually led to his being my dissertation advisor and then inviting me to co-write the book, The Psychology of Existence.
Your journey is a powerful one, and there's probably a lot more to tell. We're going to have you back to discuss in more depth the legacy component of that. I wish we could spend a bit more time on this. We do need to shift because I want to, for our audience, if you haven't seen the body of Dr. Schneider's work, it's pretty impressive, and he's written a number of really powerful works. I think not least of which is on the polarized mind. You and I had the pleasure of talking through that book a few years back, as you recall. And in my introduction today, I spent some time talking about our country's polarization, noting my own journey in trying to do better in this space. And given your work in this area, and I know it's kind of a hard shift away from just the kind of very esoteric but incredible stuff you were just talking about, but we're in really strange times, Kirk. And if you could talk about about the book, The Polarized Mind, what it entails, and what are the promises and pitfalls ahead? How does humanistic psychology flow in and out of this as you see it? So I appreciate your willingness to kind of shift a bit in this way.
Well, I was really trying to get at the roots of what drives people toward extremes, malignant extremes, destructive extremes, which I call the polarized mind. And I was drawing from all kinds of research, mainly existential depth psychology, but also anthropology, sociology, some writings about religion and spirituality. And through that immersion and through my own my personal experience with some difficult people. I grew up in a very mixed neighborhood. We were the only Jewish family in the neighborhood. Had a lot of wonderful experiences with the kids, but also some rather unsettling experiences. But anyway, that aside, drawing from all this, so I came up with what I thought was a pretty good phenomenological definition of the polarized mind, and that is that it's the fixation on a single point of view to the utter exclusion of competing points of view. And I think that definition really covers a lot of what we call individual psychopathology, from anxiety, depression, obsessive compulsion, drugs that sedate, being polarized in the contrasting direction, sociopathy, narcissism, speed, etc. The problem of not being able to deal with a feeling of insignificance. My sense is that the polarized mind and extremist behavior and experience is fear-based. It's defensive in many ways. And it basically has to do with doing everything one can to avoid the sense of smallness, helplessness, and ultimately being wiped away. I mean, what the terror management theorists would call death anxiety,
There you go. Yep.
what I call the groundlessness and helplessness of our condition, which I believe, like along with Otto Rank, along his lines, that really the template for that starts at the beginning, from our radical shift from relative non-being and unity with the cosmic, if you will, to sudden abrupt being and disunity and floundering in that and attempting to cope with that. And it does have I think it's a very unsettling, terrifying experience along with a wondrous experience. But the problem is that too often our caretakers are coming from a fear-based point of view, and the culture is coming from a fear-based point of view. So very quickly, we close in on the child in such a way that the child identifies with extreme states, so that they can avoid that primal helplessness and groundlessness. And too often, the extreme states take the form of destructive and overcompensatory, expansive kind of behaviors, like violence, warlike behavior, grandiosity, domineering kind of behavior, because the person's trying to do everything they can to avoid that primal fear, that primal anxiety. So that's a lot of what Polarized Mind was about.
And I guess kind of in follow up to, avoiding that primal fear, not to get into like easy solutions because I think there's so much more to it than this, but I think perhaps a core message is that in order for us to address this polarization, we need to lean into that and address those primal fears. Is that fair to say? And what does that look like as it manifests societally?
Yeah, I think we got to get at fear if we're going to bring about a sustained rejuvenation or revitalization, both individually, collectively. I deeply believe that. And I think, unfortunately, we come up with too many superficial solutions that are like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic.
Yes.
But we're not getting at the seed that's causing that rupture. Yeah, in my book, I look at how various cultures down through history have moved toward a polarized mindset, fixation on single points of view to utter exclusion of competing points of view. And they become tyrannical, they become fascist, they become autocratic, very uh, conformist, mechanistic, and also how individuals get shaped in that way. And what I propose is that in order to get down to the fears that underlie this destructive extremes, we need to look at a number of possibilities. I think that some of the great spiritual traditions and philosophical non-dogmatic philosophical and spiritual traditions offer us some, benefit in that way by emphasizing presence, basically. I really see presence at the root of beginning the healing process, such that people can feel like they can live with and maybe even make the best of these very primal apprehensions that we have. Presence through meditation, deep reflection, through great conversation. I would say Socrates was certainly an adherent of this conversation about what really matters to people, what has great meaning, and a conversation with another person or a mentor of some kind that can really hold the deep inquiry, the many possibilities that can come up around, meeting one's fear, one dealing with otherness, really, because that primal anxiety is a lot about suddenly realizing that there is the other out there. There is what Ron calls a psychology of difference. And if we're not supported to, in some way, come to terms with, to coexist with that otherness in other people and in ourselves, then we come from this more reactive, fear based position. So, yes, meditation, spiritual, non dogmatic spiritual, philosophical groups, and what I call the sense of awe toward living, which can be very personal or can be cultivated in certainly spiritual communities. By awe, the sense of awe, I mean discovering the humility and wonder and sense of adventure toward living. And that's very different. That's much more present to the contrasts and contradictions that would otherwise throw us into an extremist and fixated state to avoid all of that upset.
We could spend 3 hours on this topic alone, and it's so potent and salient, and your insights are really critical, I think, now more than ever. Kind of, well, it is very connected. You ran for the APA presidency, threw your hat in the ring. For those of you who don't know out there who are just coming to Saybrook or psychology, the American Psychological Association is the preeminent professional group for the discipline, and it's one of the largest, I think, associations, academic professional associations in the world. And what I was struck by, Kirk, is you brought such passion to your candidacy. I think you made a fabulous run, and part of that was promoting this concept of a psychologist general thing. Now you've shifted to more of a board of advisory board of psychologists for the government.
Office of Psychological Advisors. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah. And I think we're talking about the polarized mind and addressing how we deal with so many things at the national level and across the states. There seems to be a deep connection here. Could you speak just for a moment about this? We're unfortunately running short on time, but I'd love to hear just a few insights from you on this.
Well, my campaign is centered all around creating a national core of psychologists. I really want to rally the APA with its rich resources and its many specialties around giving this wisdom away at such a critical time where we're facing so many social crises, from the pandemic to racism
That's right.
to political polarization, violence, etc. And I think it's an emergency. And that's why I'm hoping that psychologists would want to rally around the idea of stretching themselves some. I mean, could be partly volunteer and partly, maybe largely funded. I would use the bully pulpit to attempt to get funding from government and corporate sources to basically spread our psychological resources, especially to underserved communities, but all over the country at more affordable prices. So, one of the ways is facilitating healing dialogues, structured, supportive dialogues that I've been a part of and I've been promoting, like Braver Angels work and experiential democracy dialogue. throughout the country to bring people of very different backgrounds together for these bridge building and humanizing dialogues. We're good at that. Another task, as I see it, is to create more places that would provide longer term, in depth therapy to especially underserved communities, to build relationships with people. It takes some time. We're talking about problem of a quick fix. I think we really need to think more about longer term cultivation and what it takes to really build a nourishing relationship. So a lot of this platform actually is around what I call emotionally restorative relationships. I'd like to see that with the Healing Dialogues movement, with longer term in-depth therapy being available and affordable, with more psychological help with police departments in the case of mental health crises, with bolstering this kind of support in the schools, in clinics, in hospitals, in prison settings. I mean, wherever, in government too. And that's where
That's right.
the idea of a federal office of psychological advisors comes in, is marshaling our resources directly in government in coordination with APA's advocacy. But it's like the AMA to the Surgeon General, being right in government where we can support, advise government officials from the president to Congress and maybe to the diplomatic corps to the public as well with advisories.
And to your point, I mean, I think I sound like a broken record at this point, as do many who are passionate and involved in this area. Some of the more recent statistics are showing somewhere in the realm of 111 to 120 million people in the United States alone. That does not even account for an underserved global population who are not receiving needed mental health services at all.
That's right.
And you raise, this platform of yours is so timely on multiple levels, placing polarization over here for a moment just to get basic services for our communities that are, the tyrannies that are ravaging our brothers and sisters across the country. It's pretty wicked, and this is innovative thinking, Kirk. And where is this at in terms of people buying into this concept? I mean, are you seeing interest? Is there resistance? What are your senses?
Well, I'm definitely seeing interest. I mean, I'm seeing interest in, for example, the webinars I've been presenting on experiential democracy dialogue, which is a one-on-one structured dialogue. And certainly Braver Angels has attracted a good number of people. I think they've had 10,000 last count across the country doing these groups. Within APA, there's growing interest. I mean, I'll be doing, well, I did a seminar for the New York State Psychological Association on this, and for the California State Psychological Association. And various groups are expressing more and more interest. I think there's a lot of interest in giving psychology away, so to speak, at such a critical time, and really going after a deeper, a more substantive dimension of our psychology, seeing the value of asking bigger questions and helping people to, address especially their primal fears of otherness. Because so much of this, again, is fear driven. So many of the problems we have. And getting in emotionally restorative relationships with people who presumably, and I think in many, many cases, actually are very skillful in offering the kind of mentoring and healing that so many people need. I am seeing it emerge. It's an uphill battle, but I feel passionate about it, believe me.
Well, count me as a comrade in this effort, and would be happy to talk more offline and continue our online discussions around how we can elevate this as a core priority. Kirk, we unfortunately, I mean, that went fast. I was looking at the clock here and going, oh my gosh, it felt like 10 minutes has passed. I've got two questions that I ask each of our guests, and I think you'll knock these both out of the park because you've already talked to these a little bit. These are very much quick takes. So, right at the top of your head, Kirk, the first one is, what does the term humanistic ultimately mean to you?
Formally, I would define humanistic psychology as two basic questions. What does it mean to be fully experientially human? And the second part of that, that follows from it, is what does that then imply for the vital or fulfilled life? So it's got a sort of descriptive aspect and an ethical, moral aspect. Less formally, I would say the humanistic psychology movement in America, fostered by folks like Maslow and May and Rogers, was really focused very much on intimacy, intimate human experience, intimate relationships, and being able to be more present to those kinds of deeper, intimate connections, and to some degree distinguishing itself from European tendencies toward abstraction and more of the philosophical. And of course, they would say that we're lacking in philosophy. And also the can-do practical, optimistic quality that humanistic psychology brings. And I think that's partly an American trait that we believe in possibilities and pursuing possibilities, saying yes in spite of all the no's.
That's fabulous. Thank you. Thank you for that. Okay. And then the last quick take, what are three things people can do right now to improve their mental health?
Well, I do think taking time to reflect on what deeply matters to you. And if there was ever a time to really take stock, I mean, this certainly would be such a time, given that so many of us are isolated and so bombarded by the pandemic and so many of the social crises going on. The whole question of what deeply matters to you and how can you engage that? And that often brings up questions about maybe volunteering in some way for the betterment of our world. And certainly, if you're a psychotherapist, maybe thinking about ways that you can be more accessible to all the suffering or many suffering people out there. But there's a variety of ways. It's that the point is taking time to be more present again, more aligned with your core sense of how you want to use your time and space, which is fleeting. To realize that we're dying as we're living, and this ain't a dress rehearsal, as an old friend would put it.
So true.
It's time to do it. So that's one I would say. Depth, existential, and experiential therapies can be very valuable, certainly critical in my own life. And I had a second therapy that I didn't even mention. It was life changing for me in my graduate years. And then finally, I would say, I mean, I believe strongly in cultivating a sense of awe to the degree you can, awe toward living. If you can attempt to really notice and see the more of what is going on around you beyond the often narrow and oppressive identifications we get into. We're so judgmental to ourselves, pounding or hammering ourselves. We see such horrors, obviously, on the news. One could get buried in that negativity. And I'm not saying that there's not a value to really acknowledging it. Yes, acknowledge it, but also see the amazement of what's around us, the beauty of nature, the beauty of your relationships, let's say, with people, or relationships you're trying to cultivate, the beauty of inquiry. There's more that we can be open to. It's sort of like seeing with the artist's eye. And it's extremely enriching and gratifying if one can be in that space of humility and wonder, or sense of adventure about life.
What a great way to leave us with that insight today, Kirk. And I really appreciate your time. Before we go, where can people find you on the web so that they can get as much out of you as they can?
Well, at kirkjschneider.com.
Okay, kirkjschneider.com. And they can also find you on Saybrook University's website under the faculty page. And really appreciate your time. here today, sir. Thank you.
Really appreciate our conversation, Nathan. And, the school means so much to me, as you know, deeply connected with our mission.
We'll keep it going. That interview took an incredible turn at the beginning. I really want to thank Kirk for sharing such a personal story about his entree into psychology and into his work in general today. I think it was just very powerful. I hope you enjoyed Dr. Schneider, the whole interview, as much as I did. I think it was very powerful. He had several takeaways for us that I'm going to try and boil down, probably inartfully, to three. Taking time to reflect about what deeply matters is the first one that he talks about. Volunteering, I think we've heard that around a couple of our colleagues who've joined us on the podcast recently, and really cultivate a sense of awe about the world, about your life, about those around you, and leaning into that. That can really contribute to your own improved mental health. So I hope you'll think about those three things. I think it was very, very sage wisdom from Dr. Schneider. If you want to see the video elements we've created, these segments, please visit our Saybrook YouTube page. If you'd like to support the podcast, go to Apple iTunes and leave a 5-star rating and review, and subscribe so you can get episodes as they come out. If you're one of those Spotify users, leave that 5-star rating and make sure to follow us. You can, of course, subscribe to us on most major podcast platforms, including Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Pandora, and my favorite, Pocket Casts, among others. Remember to check our show notes for information on today's guests, including links to websites, books, etc. And for more information about our psychology program or the university, go to www.saybrook.edu, click on areas of study at the top of the page, and locate the program to learn more. Or simply Google Saybrook University Psychology Program. That's a wrap. Thank you so much. Take care and be well.